but just to help us out, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A, because we're going to have half an hour at the end to really go through that and hear from you and questions that you might have. Okay, so just looking at the time, I'm going to keep going and just let people come in. So welcome to the Pan London MARAC Review. We were really pleased and privileged to be commissioned by MOPAC. So huge thanks to MOPAC for commissioning this really important piece of work in London. I know when we advertised the event on Twitter and on all our social media, a lot of people from outside London were also saying it'd be really good to come along to this to hear. I'm Gudrun Burnett, but everyone calls me Goody, and I've got the great privilege of being the Chief Exec at Standing Together. Standing Together have, pioneered the coordinated community response. So we do work across housing, criminal justice, health, faith and communities, domestic homicide reviews, but also MARAC. And we've been invested in the MARACS from its inception, really, in Hammersmith and Fulham as well, and other areas. So we were really pleased to be commissioned to do this piece of work. You're going to hear all about it from the amazing individuals that were involved. So that includes Katie from our team in Standing Together, but then also the University of Suffolk, the Centre for Abuse Research team, who we partnered with, and the partnership's just been amazing. So a huge shout out, and you're going to hear from them later. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. If you want to tweet, please do. It's always good to kind of raise awareness. You've got the hashtag there, and also tag people in. And also just how to get in contact with us. I think I've done all of the housekeeping bits. We're probably going to end at about 2:20, which is a little bit earlier than probably people expected. So you'll be able to get a cup of tea at the end or have a little bit of a break, because we're all very, very back to back now. And yeah, I think that is everything I need to say. We're up to 150 participants now, which is absolutely fantastic. This is being recorded as well, so you'll be able to. And also the report, we're going to put that in the link. We're going to put it in the chat as we go. So you'll be able to access the full report and the executive summary at the end of this event. So without further ado, this woman doesn't need really an introduction. It's Sophie Linden, who is absolutely incredible and has supported this work from day dot. We're really pleased that Sophie, considering how busy she is, can actually join us today and fill us in on the importance of this work and obviously MOPAC's perspective. I think, Sophie, I've had the pleasure of seeing you twice now in a week, which is fantastic, because we haven't been able to touch base as much as I would have liked recently, because of how busy it's been. So yeah, so passing it over to Sophie.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Goody. And it's really good. I'm really good to be here. And it's fabulous to see the number of people here, and that it's not just London, and there's an interest of this outside of London as well. Really, really brilliant. I'd just like to start by saying thank you very much to Katie London, Dr. Olamide Adisa for leading the research and writing the report, more importantly, and along with the University of Suffolk co-authors Joanna Ferreira and Dr. Catherine Allen. It's so brilliant to be able to, through MOPAC and through the commissioning and that we've done, to be able to work with such fantastic experts and expertise. And I hope that the contents of the review of the MARACs in London are going to be helpful, not just in London, but across the country as well. It's really so important for me that we did this review, because myself and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, have always had tackling violence against women and girls as a top priority, and we're really, determined that every woman is as safe as they can be and feels safe in our city. But we know, and you know, and that's why you're all here, that we have got a long way to go to achieve this, and that the reality is that far too many women experience the scourge of domestic abuse in our city, in their homes, far too often, and also far too complex. The violence is actually has been increasing as well. We know, and that's why I'm sure why you're here as well, that the impact of domestic abuse on the lives of the women affected is so incredibly far-reaching. It obviously impacts them as victims and then survivors, but that also the impact on their children and then the wider community. And the Mayor has invested record amounts in tackling violence against women and girls in order to be able to put together support for victims, reduce waiting lists, and frankly, to keep the doors open for vital specialist support services for victims. We've also managed to work with and invest in services to tackle the behaviour of perpetrators, and we are working to really vitally improve the police response to domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. The investment has included specialist services for Black and marginalised communities, LGBTQ+, and for male survivors of sexual violence and domestic abuse as well. And of course, it includes the important work that we're here today to discuss. The review that you were here to discuss today was part of our current Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. I say current because we are refreshing that at the moment. We hope to come out with a new, building on what we have already got, but a new strategy in the new year. The review has clearly set out the successes, challenges, the gaps, and the emerging themes around the MARAC process in London. And we're committed, as the Mayor committed to in his action plan to improve transparency, accountability and trust in policing, we've got to consider whether concerns about immigration status and perceptions of policing deter women from reporting crimes committed against them, even when their life is in danger. And that's especially important given the MARAC process is funded and delivered differently across London, meaning we need a proper analysis of what works and how positive outcomes are achieved for victims. And that's why I'm so pleased that this review has addressed this, as well as many other pertinent issues that I deal with day to day in my role as Deputy Mayor for Policing Crime here in London. And I know you as professionals will be dealing with in a much more frontline way than I deal with them. And I want to thank you for the work that you do. As I said, brilliant that this review has been undertaken by such expertise and specialists who really understand the multiple disadvantages faced by many high-risk domestic abuse victims, and they've had a deep-rooted understanding of the intersectional issues that were at play. I just wanted to pick on a couple of things that their insights and their contribution has given. I've talked about trust and confidence, and that's so important. It is a key priority area, and I think the role of the MARAC chair it's incredibly important in this, and often it's mostly performed by the police, and the importance of MARAC training should include awareness of intersectionality and cultural competence to increase trust and confidence in the police. It also, the report importantly addresses how COVID-19 has compounded and exacerbated many of the structural or financial issues that were already faced by many victims of domestic abuse. And again, we've had a key piece of work within MOPAC around the pandemic in providing, for example, refuge emergency accommodation for women fleeing violence. And thirdly, how many MARACs are striving to keep victims safe and, really importantly, work with partners to manage the behaviour of perpetrators. Last week, I visited the London Victims and Witness Service. And what I was really shocked, and I had been told this, but it's always different when you go and visit a service, isn't it? When you talk to the front line, and it really, really did bring home to me. I heard about the volumes of the cases that particularly IDVAs were coping with and ISVAs are coping with, the complexity of need, and particularly around mental health. And very, very concerningly, I heard about the severity of the violence, particularly rape, amongst DA victims, and that severity has increased significantly during the pandemic and still remains elevated. The work of IDVAs has been made more difficult as many agencies are still struggling with COVID recovery. For example, we've heard that one MARAC was holding waiting lists, which was a really just serious concern considering the risk management and safety planning focus of MARAC. I also heard about the pressures on IDVAs of such a large and intensive workload and the impact it's having on their welfare. More effective multi-agency working is going to undoubtedly be part of the solution for effective MARACs. But given the increased need, complexity and the greater levels of violence, funding to DA services, including MARACs, has got to be increased so they meet this higher demand. Deep-rooted throughout the entire review is the need to recognise intersectionality, understanding harmful practices, and the important role of by and for services and the management of perpetrators, as I've touched on already. And that's something that's incredibly important, both to the Mayor and I, considering and examining how all the work we do is done with an intersectional lens, so that those who are impacted most by these horrific crimes get the support and attention that they deserve. We've just recently completed a victim strategic needs assessment at MOPAC, which has raised many points around cultural competency of agencies, the need to address language barriers, support for victims with no recourse for public funds, and better pathways into mental health support. And these findings are, alongside the work that other work as well, are being used to inform our future commissioning and to strengthen our joint work with criminal justice partners. These are really significant and complex areas, and if we can work with partners to develop our practice around these issues, we're going to be able to bring about, and I'm optimistic about this, bring about meaningful and much needed improvements for survivors. And I know that we can make that difference. I am optimistic, however hard and challenging it is. I don't need to tell anyone in this virtual room how important, it's more important than ever to address violence against women and girls, and domestic abuse has been, is absolutely at the heart of that. I know that we've seen the horrific murders of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer, the failings in the cases of the devastating murders of Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, and we've all, I'm sure, and I know we've all been deeply impacted by this, as we will have through the experiences of the countless other women who don't hit the headlines, but who are dealing with the violence, fear and intimidation in their day-to-day lives at the hands of men. It's only made worse by the structural and ingrained misogynistic attitudes that are deep-rooted in our society, and they create an environment where more violent behaviours are enabled to flourish. And fundamentally, change needs to happen, and that change is not going to happen unless we address the root causes of violence, which stem from the misogynistic attitudes which are so prevalent in our society. And I know we're all absolutely committed to do that. Now, I've taken more than my time, Goody, so I shall stop. It's just, I'm very passionate about this, and I'm really pleased that we've managed to, we have done this review despite COVID, and this really important recommendations, really important insight and analysis and focus on how the MARACs are working. I'd just like to say to those of you that are working on the MARACs, thank you so much for the work you do. You deal with the most high-risk cases. I know it's incredibly difficult. I've heard of MARACs that are sitting till 7 o'clock at night because they have such a huge casework. So thank you so much for everything you do in doing your part in keeping victims and survivors of domestic abuse safe. Thank you. Goody.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks so much for your passion and always backing this work, and also always paying homage to those that are doing the frontline work, because like you say, it's been a really, really tough, it's tough doing the work, but in the context of COVID, it has been some of the toughest times ever in the sector, and for you to acknowledge that, I know means a lot to us at Standing Together, but will to a lot of people that are listening. So thanks so much, Sophie, for coming. Really appreciate it, and thanks for commissioning this piece of work. Right, so without further ado, the next person on the agenda is Susan Price. So hi, Susan. We've been working really closely with Sue and the MOPAC team, and couldn't have done obviously this piece of work without her guidance and support and all the rest of it. It's been a real pleasure working with you. So I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Since their introduction in 2003, MARACS plays a critical role in coordinating multi-agency responses to survivors of domestic abuse. They are key in providing effective case management and risk mitigation, bringing together statutory and VCS organisations to ensure the best outcomes for survivors and their families. However, a MARAC is not an intervention in itself. Rather, it's a forum to coordinate the multi-agency response, and therefore positive outcomes rely on all agencies taking responsibility to follow up referrals, proactively work together and implement the actions agreed. Currently, there is little consistency across attendance at London MARACs or in the mitigations and outcomes that are proposed in actions, resulting in a postcode lottery for survivors being referred into this process. This is particularly pertinent in light of the MOPAC domestic homicide report analysis, which found that many of these victims were not discussed at a MARAC. This demonstrated an urgent need to examine what is currently working, where improvements need to be made, and where the levers for change are in terms of achieving the best outcomes for all survivors. The crime survey for England and Wales stated an estimated 1.6 million women and 786,000 men experienced domestic abuse in the year ending 31st March 2019. During this time, the police recorded 746,219 domestic abuse-related crimes. That's an increase of 24% from the previous year. Turning to London, in the same period to March 2019, there were 88,278 recorded domestic abuse offences across the Metropolitan Police Force area. That was an increase of 12% from 2018. A Home Office report published in January 2019 estimated that the cost of domestic abuse for victims in England and Wales was approximately 66 billion. The largest component of this estimated cost was the physical and emotional harm experienced by victims, which accounted for about 47 million. The months following the COVID-19 lockdown in the UK have seen an increase in DA offences. Our MOPAC evidence and insight data shows the consistent monthly increase in DA offences in London, with the rolling trend showing there were 89,877 offences in March 2020. These offences rose to 94,784 in October 2021, which is higher than the 4-year average. Despite these alarming figures, underreporting to police continues to be high, particularly for groups who may have multiple disadvantage and those from minoritized backgrounds. Women from Black and minoritized ethnic backgrounds continue to be disproportionately represented in domestic abuse and related victimization figures. MARACS are not part of the statutory response to domestic abuse in the UK, but they are commonly used in all 32 London boroughs and across the country. Available evidence on MARAC outcomes is relatively weak. The benefits of MARACs are purported to include reduction in current and future victimisation, with Safe Lives reporting that following intervention by a MARAC and an IDVA service, up to 60% of domestic abuse victims report no further violence. MARAC success relies on all agencies taking responsibilities to follow up referrals, proactively work together and implement the actions agreed. Currently, the lack of consistency across attendance at London MARACs results in a postcode lottery for survivors. There is a vital need to maximise the skills and knowledge base of all agencies and ensure clear communication pathways to tackle perpetrators, protect children and keep survivors safe. The Mayor's Police and Crime Plan puts victim survivors at the heart of everything MOPAC does, making significant commitments regarding the provision of better services and improving the experience of the criminal justice system for victims of crime. The plan highlights the issue of repeat victimisation as an important challenge in effectively tackling domestic abuse. Domestic abuse has a higher rate of repeat victimisation, where 1 in 4 offences are committed against repeat victims. The MOPAC Fraud strategy builds on the commitment to the Police and Crime Plan and sets out the measures to prevent fraud, tackle perpetrators, and to protect and support victims. MOPAC's commissioning of the London Pan MARAC Review, the Pan London MARAC Review was driven by our existing tackling fraud strategy, which has 2 commitments related to undertaking a review of MARACs in London. We commissioned Standing Together and University of Suffolk to undertake the Pan London MARAC Review, and we congratulate them on producing a comprehensive and robust report. The findings and the good thorough recommendations, which you hear about shortly, put us in an excellent position to work with our partners in the police, the specialist DA sector and local authorities to continue discussions on how we can all work together to improve the effectiveness of MARACs in London. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. That was great. Like I said before, it's been so great to work with you. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to the main authors of the report so we can get into the nitty-gritty of what we found and our recommendations. So I'm going to pass over to Katie London, who really has gone above and beyond on this piece of work. And I just want to say a huge thank you, Katie, to all of your hard work, and obviously to Catherine and Joanna too, because it's been a real team effort, and we're going to hear from Olamide in the panel as well, hopefully. So over to you, Katie.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Goody. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to this event. I'm Katie London, as Goody's just said, and I'm the MARAC team manager at Standing Together. I'm one of the report authors, and I'm going to be joined in this presentation by Catherine Allen and Joanna Fiera as well from the Centre of Abuse Research. We're going to briefly talk through our findings and our recommendations, and as Goody said earlier, the report will be published this afternoon on our website, so I hope that you all enjoy it when you get to read it. So just if we can just go to the next slide. So in terms of framing the review, I'm just going to provide some context just to discuss, just summarising really what MARAC is. So the MARAC aims to reduce the risk to those survivors of domestic homicide who are assessed to be at high risk of serious harm. The understanding is that MARAC is not just a meeting, but is that multi-agency process. And as of October 2021, Safe Lives reported approximately 290 MARACs across the UK, from whom they're collating MARAC data from on a quarterly basis. And underpinning MARAC is that coordinated community response model, that understanding that risks cannot be managed alone by one agency. Those of you who are familiar with Standing Together will know that Standing Together pioneered this response in the UK over 20 years ago, following the work of Ellen Pence, who created the model in Duluth, Minnesota. And essentially, it's that every agency who has that responsibility for dealing with survivors, their children, and/or perpetrators must be able to work effectively within their own agency and with all other agencies who have that responsibility. They need to be able to secure the safety of the survivor and their children and hold perpetrators to account. As you can see on this graphic here, the CCR encompasses the broadest possible response to domestic abuse, addressing prevention, early intervention, crisis and risk fluctuation, recovery and safety, looking at a wide range of services, pathways, agencies and systems. And as you can see, MARAC forms part of this CCR, and this was underpinning our research. The review also sought to consider the Safe Lives 10 principles for an effective MARAC across London, of which we're going to go into a bit more detail. And as you're aware, MOPAC commissioned this review into London MARACS, and this review was carried out by ourselves, the Centre for Abuse Research, and the project began in July of 21 of this year, and research concluded in 2021. Just on to the next slide. So what does the London landscape look like? So just to give you some context around data and volume, Safe Lives published the national data set for the MARACS by region for each financial year since 2018. On reviewing this data nationally, whilst we were doing this report, MARACS nationally were hearing 110% of their expected volume in the financial year of 2020 to 21, which was a 9% increase on the previous financial year, indicating a slight increase in MARAC cases nationally during the pandemic. When we reviewed the data specifically for London, MARACS were hearing 119% of the expected volume across the last financial year, which was an increase of 22% when it was compared to the previous. And this is notable given that the previous financial year to that, it was only 4%, which was indicating that London MARACS were dealing with a significant increase of referrals during the pandemic, which would then have had a knock-on effect to resourcing. In terms of frequency of MARACS, so this does vary across London with several models being used, as you can see in the yellow chart here. The pie chart, with the most common being around every 2 weeks at 38%, or every month for 25%. And the MARAC coordination delivery varies across London as well, with the majority of coordinators being employed by local authorities, others being coordinated by the police, and a further group being coordinated by the voluntary sector, of which Standing Together is one of these, coordinating 5 MARACs in London. At present, little research has been carried out on those different models in terms of frequency and coordination delivery, and there is a further variation in terms of chairing of MARACs in London, with the majority being the police, but a handful of violence against women and girls leads or other statutory services being involved either as vice chairs or co-chairs. We can go to the next slide around methodology. So I'm going to just talk you through the different types of research that we carried out. So we had a mixed methods approach, which was adopted, combining both quantitative and qualitative. We also had all of our research materials approved for use by the University of Suffolk Ethics Committee, and our experience collectively and further inform this review. In terms of the surveys, we had 2 online surveys which were developed for professionals involved with MARACs across the boroughs. There was one that was designed specifically for the chairs, the coordinators and partner agencies, of which we had 184 participants. There was also a survey developed for specialist services, of which we had 73. So in total, we had 257 participants for the survey. The interviews were conducted via Microsoft Teams. That was with the MARAC coordinators and chairs across different boroughs in London. We had 29 participants, and the questions were aimed at exploring the participants' views of the challenges and the gaps faced by their MARAC, their perception of its performance and effectiveness, and ultimately the richness of their experience within their role of MARAC. And these interviews were carried out on Teams. We also held a desktop review. So we had reviewed MARAC operating protocols or procedures, samples of anonymised minutes and observations of meetings for 9 MARACs in total. We also had 2 MARACs that we were able to observe a single meeting. We also carried out a review of Safe Lives performance data between 2018 and June 2021 for 16 MARACs. and we reviewed referral forms for 31 MARACs. We saw within this desktop review sample, particularly in relation to the observations, a mixture of frequency. So this covered daily meetings, weekly, 2 weekly, 3 weekly and monthly, and we covered these boroughs as seen on screen. I'm now going to hand over to Catherine to talk through principles 1 to 4, and I'll join you shortly.
Thank you very much, Katie. So as Katie's explained, we collected data through multiple methods, but in terms of our findings, we decided to organise it thematically. So we've actually organised all our findings and recommendations according to the 10 Safe Lives principles, which essentially are designed to underpin an effective MARAC and to support everyone involved to achieve the aims. And at the core of each principle is the safety of the survivor. Yeah, so the first 2 principles, they're interconnected, and they relate to professionals' ability to accurately recognise and risk assess high-risk cases of domestic abuse based on the referral criteria for the MARAC, and to ensure that all victims who meet the MARAC threshold are referred to MARAC and to an independent domestic violence advisor. So as you can see from our findings, overall, they were quite encouraging. So more than 83% of our survey participants did feel that their MARAC fulfilled the Safe Lives principle of clear risk identification. In terms of the referral criteria used across the boroughs, and we have the data on this for 31 out of 32 boroughs. So the 4 most commonly used criteria were potential escalation, which is defined as, according to the Safe Lives criteria, as 3 or more incidents, although there is some degree of variation based on local reporting and needs. And the visible high risk, according to the DASH risk indication checklist, which is based on a score of 14 or higher. And again, those are both 94%. And also on professional judgment, because it is recognised that although risk assessment, more structured processes can be useful, there is also need for people to be able to use their judgment in these things. And also repeat victimization was the 4th most common criteria. And that was defined as any incident of domestic abuse between the same survivor and perpetrator within a 12-month period of the case originally being discussed at MARAC. However, there was some variation in terms of the criteria. So you can see that there being a Clare's Law disclosure request was used in 6% of cases, and other kind of repeat incidents, which weren't necessarily listed as a criteria, but were asked about in the referral form. And interestingly, around 19% of criteria did include references to things such as harmful practices of various kinds, adult familial violence, so that's violence between adult children towards their parents, and honour-based violence and forced marriage, which I'll touch on a bit further in the recommendations. Sorry, just to go back. Yeah, so and as you can see, although some degree of flexibility is desirable, maybe there were also issues in terms of a lack of uniformity and standardisation in MARAC delivery across boroughs. So, for example, differences in referral forms, which some felt could make cross-borough intervention and collaboration challenging. Thank you. Go to the next slide now. And so Katie has already touched on frequency. So she has mentioned that the desktop review also showed kind of a degree of variation, and survey participants, as you can see, they said that although a minority of MARACs were held weekly, most among survey participants, their MARAC took place on a fortnightly basis. And this variation was already in place before the pandemic, with some advocating for more regular meetings or even daily meetings, and others rejecting such an approach. And in most cases, the frequency of the meeting seems to reflect the caseload and the increased number of referrals, and the need to keep partners engaged and work within their capacity. Thank you. Go to the next slide. So the recommendations based on our findings for principles 1 and 2, they sort of reflect the overall positive findings that we had, but the areas where maybe there was a lack of standardisation where it would have been helpful. So firstly, we reckoned that further research is required by MOPAC on the effectiveness of different models of MARACs operating in terms of frequency, performance and coordination delivery. We also recommend that local authorities convene and ensure there is a common referral criteria across London MARACs, which takes into account the wider context of org, specifically around the inclusion of adult family violence and harmful practices as criteria. Because obviously these are important forms of violence, but the dynamics may be different in certain respects from intimate partner violence, and further research is needed to look at how MARACs can most effectively address these as well. Yeah, so we've essentially said that more exploration and more research is needed in these areas. So principle 3 is around multi-agency engagement, and it's essentially around the idea that certain core agencies who are able to contribute to safeguarding high-risk victims, associated children and vulnerable adults attend the MARAC and engage in an effective and consistent way. So our findings regarding principle 3 were again broadly positive. So 85% of survey participants did feel that their MARAC embodied the Safe Lives principle of multi-agency working. And the MARACs who participated in the observations showed good attendance from a range of core agencies. And so in terms of defining core agencies, that's the police, the IDVA service, housing and children's services, and national probation or community rehabilitation services, as well as other services such as mental health and substance misuse. Specialist DA and IDVA services and police and children's services and housing were all identified as regular MARAC attendants by most survey participants. However, participants did also identify irregular attendance and a lack of engagement among some agencies, including several core agencies, as challenges, and particularly in reference to probation and mental health. They were the ones that seemed to come up the most. And additionally, while attendance is broadly good, a lack of research and adequate preparation was identified as an ongoing issue for some agencies, which then limits the effectiveness of participation and has impact on the wider MARAC process and the efficiency of meetings as well. So in terms of resourcing and capacity, this might slightly speak to why in some cases attendance and engagement were maybe less than would be ideal. So both interviewees and survey participants highlighted that as the MARAC is an add-on or a side job for agency representatives, the sort of time-consuming nature of attending MARAC meetings, of preparing, may mean that it's not always prioritised as it should be, and the requisite time isn't always able to be invested in it. So this is maybe what some of the issues around a lack of ownership and attendance can be for some agencies. And unsurprisingly, given the issues in resourcing and capacity identified for core agencies, although specialist DA services and buy and for services again were identified as adding a lot of value to the discussion, very few MARACs had them as a core or consistent attendee, and which may be in part because they're often covering a wider geographical area and operating with reduced resources. So in terms of our recommendations for principle 3, one of the main ones is essentially that core agencies, as set out by Safe Lives, must ensure that they participate in the MARAC process both operationally and strategically. So in addition to kind of regular attendance, it's things like the ongoing communication, the taking more ownership of things, and the research and issues like that. So a further recommendation was that all partners involved in MARAC must attend training before participating in the MARAC process. And there needs to be regular MARAC training available to chairs and representatives, which includes, but is not limited to, the roles and responsibilities of partners in the MARAC process, especially around issues of intersectionality, trauma-informed practices and cultural competency, and also around harmful practices. And finally, it's imperative that London MARACs have representation that reflects their local diverse communities, and local authorities must ensure that equality is at the core of the MARAC operating protocols by including representation of buy and for organisations. And as I've mentioned, with the kind of issues around resourcing and capacity, it's important that funding plays a part in this. So it's crucial for ongoing dialogue to be established by local authorities to ensure that engagement can be a collaborative endeavour and they can kind of appear on a regular basis and continue to contribute rather than just featuring as an occasional kind of guest. Next slide, please. And then the fourth principle is around independent representation and support for survivors. So it's about ensuring that all high-risk survivors are offered the support of an IDVA and their views and needs are represented at MARAC. And so our findings for principle 4 were somewhat more mixed or generally positive, but participants all agreed that survivors' interests should be centred in the MARAC process, and most did feel that survivors' voices were being represented via a specialist domestic abuse service participation and IDVA participation. And in the observations, all cases had been referred to a specialist DA service prior to the meeting. In terms of survivor experience, just under half of surveyed specialist organisations felt that survivors had a positive experience of MARAC, so it was about 49%. In terms of the reasons for this, their open-ended responses suggested a range of reasons, including a lack of survivor involvement or consultation, a lack of tangible outcomes in some cases, and a feeling of mistrust and feeling let down by services. And this was particularly the case for survivors experiencing multiple disadvantage. So there was just, in general, there was a sense that people didn't feel they were being served as maybe you hoped they would. And in terms of survivor feedback, this was another issue. So most MARACs did not appear to have structured processes in place to gather feedback from survivors on an ongoing basis. And our participants put forward some really useful suggestions to ensure that survivors' voices are placed at the forefront of the process, including training and awareness raising with communities and local authorities and tackling the barriers to reporting that we know are out there. So our recommendations in terms of these findings were that the MARAC meeting should be structured to ensure that the survivor's voice remains at the heart of the discussion and ensure that feeding back to survivors after MARAC meetings is part of the action planning process. So this isn't an optional add-on, this is something that should be crucial. MARACs can do this by having the specialist domestic abuse service to present their updates after the referring agent, or in the event that they're not directly involved, the agency who has a strong existing relationship with the survivor. And this will enable the discussion to be more survivor focused and led. And finally, that local authorities must ensure they have robust survivor feedback loops for the MARAC process. So I think that's all my section now. And I think Joanna will be taking the third part of the presentation. Thank you.
It'll be myself, Catherine, sorry, I've just been jumping in before Joanna. So just to talk about principle 5, so that was around information sharing. And this principle considers how information sharing should take place in the MARAC process, and considering that information sharing must be relevant and proportionate to the risks involved, and that agencies are researching cases ahead of the meeting in order to provide this update, but also liaising with one another as well. So in terms of what we found, so overall survey findings found that an overwhelming majority of participants across both surveys was that the MARAC does embody this principle of salient, proportionate and risk-focused information sharing with around 88 to 89%. There were variations seen in terms of how that information sharing was taking place following the pandemic. So all MARACs had moved to a virtual platform, either MS Teams or Google Meets. There'd also been some changes to the process in how information sharing was taking place for some MARACs, with some requesting research from agencies in advance of the meeting to the coordinator, a draft minutes document then being circulated to agencies prior to the meeting, and then agencies at the actual meeting itself summarising their research and then focusing on that action planning discussion, with the expectation they would have read the research ahead of time. And it was noted that in some of the observations that in terms of the minute review that we carried out, that sometimes minutes were maybe unnecessarily lengthy in some of these instances, which may fall short of GDPR standards, so we would have a warning of caution there. In contrast to that, other MARACs had not been requesting research in advance, and there had been full case discussion and action planning taking place on the virtual platform as opposed to the in-person meetings that used to be held. Both coordinators and chairs in the interviews had mentioned how concise and succinct information sharing is really central for the MARAC meetings to run effectively, particularly considering the high number of referrals being discussed at each meeting. But most interviewees mentioned that they were trying to keep case discussions at around 10 minutes, with the exception of particularly complex cases, but the time frame was very difficult to enforce at times without sort of losing the content of that. In terms of the structure of the meetings and the structure of that information sharing, ordering of cases and discussions had varied across the boroughs, with some MARACs hearing guest cases first, survivors who are pregnant, those with children and those were out, whereas others did not have specific ordering. The majority of boroughs that were observed in the desktop review had a referring agency start the presentation, and then the specialist domestic abuse service was brought in to capture the survivor's voice, followed by police and then other agencies. And the way that this agencies were contributing did vary, with some chairs requesting updates directly of agencies, or others requesting that the hands up feature was used within the virtual platform to indicate that that agency held information. And whereas most agencies had prepared research prior to the meeting, there were some agencies who hadn't, and this was being researched during the call, which then did significantly impact the flow of the meeting and would likely impact the strength of partnership with agencies. And this was echoed in the interviews with coordinators and chairs, who did share frustrations around this practice and that it had led to them not being meaningfully engaged with the process. This was put down to lack of resources, as mentioned by Catherine, particularly where agencies are holding multiple roles in this rather than just being a sole dedicated representative. But they also did mention sometimes the buy-in from the individual of the agency was an issue as well and had impacted that. In some meetings as well, some agencies were present but did not contribute. So whilst attendance on paper may have improved since the pandemic, it didn't necessarily always equate to engagement in some of the meetings. In terms of the communication, so when we were looking at the interviews, most of them were satisfied with the level of communication of partner agencies, so describing good relationships, with some interviews discussing daily or weekly informal contacts with representatives, whether that's with email or phone, or following up on communicating through formal structures like steering groups. Some practitioners highlighted the difficulties brought about by the pandemic and the consequent increase in caseload, but many reflected on the need to implement strategies for building good relationships in an era where face-to-face contact is significantly limited. So spontaneous meetings were no longer possible, and they were looking at alternatives to help facilitate trust and build relationships outside of those MARAC meetings, which is so vital. And regarding communication between partner agencies, this was something that coordinators and chairs found difficult to assess, and it was often only observed in interactions between representatives within the meeting, often revealing the levels of communication that have been seen outside of the meeting as well. And it's just further highlights the important point that this multi-agency cooperation continues to be vitally important before and after the MARAC meetings, and that the MARAC meeting is just one part of that process. So that information sharing is really important in order for the ultimate aims of MARAC to be fulfilled. So in terms of the recommendations, they actually link to recommendations that we have already mentioned. So I won't go into details, but they relate to core agencies attendance, but both in an operational and strategic participation, as well as attendance of training, so that attendees understand clearly their roles and responsibilities, but also understand some of the other issues of intersectionality, trauma-informed practices, cultural competency, and harmful practices as well. If we move on to principle 6, so this refers to action planning. So this principle examines the way in which MARAC addresses risks faced by survivors, and this should include actions related to the survivor, the children, any adults at risk, and the perpetrator. What we found in this section, this principle, is that some agencies did require prompting to offer actions or discuss actions, and there were issues in assigning actions in cases where the survivor maybe had not been contactable prior to the meeting, and this did prove difficult, particularly if there were no other agencies involved with the survivor directly. Other MARACs had productive non-prompted discussions around action planning, and options available, with a variety of agencies participating in this discussion. And what really shone through was the coordinators who played a really key part in that action planning discussion, with some identifying what actions were required when agencies maybe hadn't volunteered them initially. And the chairs and the coordinators often led these discussions and were vital in keeping this discussion focused and productive. In terms of the actual actions, so the majority of actions related to the survivor's wishes and safeties, further highlighting that important role of the Specialist Domestic Abuse Service at the MARAC, who often represented. It was noted that there were inconsistencies across the meeting for the offer of police actions at times, with thresholds for certain safety measures being unclear or varied. So, for example, special schemes being placed on an address in one area and then not in another, or the offer of panic alarms or Texos enabled mobile devices. And this is something that would need to be resolved to ensure there's uniformity. There were also noted to be some inconsistencies at times about how actions were recorded in some MARACs, and this may impact on how it was tracked. The majority of them had been assigned to an agency and given a specified timescale, which is best practice. However, there were some MARACs that hadn't given a timescale as such, which can lead to ambiguity around the urgency and the accountability of agency. So we would strongly encourage that timescales are assigned. Flagging of a survivor's file post-meeting was not routinely added as an action on cases. Flagging of cases can assist identification for repeat instances and referrals into MARAC, but can also inform the professionals working with the survivor to help enhance the support they receive. And additionally, feedback to the survivor was not routinely listed as an action in all MARACs, which I know Catherine has previously discussed. And there was some inconsistency at times at how the action planning discussion ended. Some MARACs had summarised the actions at the end of the discussion, but others did not. And it would be best practice to summarise actions at the end of the discussion to ensure that everyone agrees with the wording and that no actions are missed. And it could be that actions that were mentioned in discussion haven't made it onto the minutes, and it just ensures continuity. And then in relation to perpetrator management, this was seen as one of the gaps in MARAC provision, both equally and more broadly also within the response to domestic abuse. Some participants cited a lack of attention to managing perpetrator behaviour, sometimes accompanied by that hyper-focus or responsibilisation of the survivor. And it's really important, as we see in the CCR, that there's a need to engage with perpetrator domestic abuse to hold them accountable to ensure that the survivor-led process does not occur in detriment to the survivor. In the observations, the provision for perpetrator services was varied, and this impacted on the action plan and discussions around perpetrator management. And there were some MARACs that participated who had perpetrator panels, which saw options available for perpetrator disruption tactics and programs to change behaviour, and this did seem to enrich those action planning discussions. When we go to the survey, around 44% of partner agency participants and 32% of specialist service participants believed that the MARAC was effectively managing perpetrator behaviour, indicating that there needs to be further work to ensure that whilst the process is survivor-led, it's not disproportionately becoming a burden of the MARAC intervention for the survivor. So this leads into our recommendations that MARACs should operate alongside effective perpetrator management, and this will involve ensuring that perpetrator management is discussed as part of that action planning discussion at the end to consider what options are available. This may mean convening with your agencies to work on what potential options are available, and an additional recommendation there to ensure that local authorities are establishing better perpetrator management options locally. And also a further recommendation that's linked to Principle 4 to ensure that the survivor's voice is at the heart of that discussion and that feedback is part of that process, to ensure that the survivor is part of that discussion. And I'll just move on to Principle 7. So this relates to number of cases. So Safe Lives recommends that there should be 40 cases per 10,000 of the population, based on the estimated prevalence of high-risk domestic abuse, that MARAC should be seeing around 80 to 100% of this volume per year. It is important to note this is the current performance is measured by the 2011 census, so it may be that there's slight differences once the 2021 census is published in next year. In terms of volume, so we had a sample of 16 MARACs safe life return. When we looked at 2019, 6% were seeing under their recommended volume, 31% seeing within the recommendation of 80 to 100%, and 63% were over their recommended volume. When we compared this to 2020, 88% of MARACs were then seeing their recommended volume of cases, which was an increase on 63%. And when we had a look at the first 6 months of 2021, all MARACs except one within that sample were experiencing between a 3% and 49% increase, indicating that the caseloads continued to rise during the pandemic. And as I mentioned earlier, London as a whole has seen that increase in volume. In terms of referring agencies, so 75% of the MARACs in this sample had police as the top referring agency, accounting for around 9% to 46% of all referrals across the 2020 financial year. And in 2020, the remaining MARACs had the IDVAs as top referring agency, being between 31 and 47% of those referrals. Other top referrers were noted to be Children's Services, the voluntary sector, and other. Other would incorporate agencies not necessarily fitting within the core agencies, but also MARAC to MARAC transfers when somebody's moved out of borough. And all boroughs were noted to have a range of agencies referring into their meeting as well, which was best practice. Some of the issues that were noted within this section and this principle is that some MARACs had increased frequency during the pandemic to cope with demand, whereas others had noted the length of the meeting increasing, which has a knock-on effect to resourcing. And some boroughs had differing responses around how MARAC transfers were being dealt with. So this is where a survivor moves from one area to another. Some boroughs had listed those cases as mention only, and others noted they didn't routinely list cases where the survivor was in a refuge or had been transferred unless there had been given a specific reason. And the report just would want to have caution over that approach to ensure that with the MARACs are continuing to follow Safe Lives guidance on this matter. So in terms of the recommendations for this, the recommendation is for a standardised MARAC performance assessment to be put in place across London, either collected by MOPAC or London councils, but this should really be developed through a multi-agency collaborative approach across London that considers the uniqueness of each MARAC, the needs of each borough, which will be different, to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to that MARAC process. And this MARAC performance could be monitored on a regional basis by a suggested London-wide MARAC steering group. And further to that, the other links to recommendations are from Principle 1 and 2. The further research is still required on the different models currently taking place in London. So I'd now pass you over to Joanna to talk you through Principles 8 to 10, and I'll join you after that.
Thank you, Katie. I'll try to be as quick as I can, given that there's a lot of overlap with what's already been discussed. So firstly, we have Principle 8, which refers to equality. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. This principle focuses then on MARAC's ability to adequately support the needs of survivors with protected characteristics. So this was used in our review to examine intersectionality across MARACs, which we know is fundamental to provide a holistic approach to survivors' needs, particularly those who are exposed to multiple sources of vulnerability or disadvantage. So this issue of intersectionality points us to three findings. Firstly, in terms of specialist representation, from our review, protected characteristics were often asked for in referral forms, but they were not routinely displayed on minutes, case lists, or discussed during the meeting, which we thought was a missed opportunity. We also found that very few MARACs have representation of by and for specialist agencies. And where they were present, this was mostly in a guest capacity. However, it is important to point out that in the interviews, some of the participants mentioned that this could be due to lack of resourcing and capacity. And as Catherine said, the fact that these agencies often operate in a very large area and are often overworked. Even so, the most common method for ensuring that there is adequate representation from marginalized communities was from the inclusion of by and for specialist services, either as guest or core agencies. This was what was proposed by our participants. We move then to diversity of survivors' voices, which is clearly connected to this issue of representation. And here it's important to say that participants' thoughts on the issue of diversity reflected their understandings of what the gaps at MARAC were, for instance, what groups were underrepresented. But they also reflected their understandings of broader issues in terms of survivors of domestic abuse and their access to support, for instance, their reluctance to report their abuse or to seek help. In terms of ensuring diversity, there were several challenges identified, particularly during the interviews, such as poor recording of diversity data, such as sexuality, for instance. Also lack of understanding of a cultural context, which means we might be overlooking certain aspects of someone's experience. And then broader domestic abuse related issues, as I said, such as reluctance to report or to seek help. Most importantly, the interviews and the surveys revealed that diversity of survivors and ensuring this diversity requires knowledge of the dynamics of domestic abuse affecting those exposed to multiple sources of disadvantage, such as LGBTQ+, or migrants with no recourse to public funds. And this was thought to be achieved particularly by seeking input of specialist agencies. And finally, we have trauma-informed practice. And this was an area where further training and awareness was thought might be needed in order to avoid responsibilization of survivors, which is emerged, for instance, as a harmful pattern of behavior within some MARACs. If I could have the next slide. Thank you. I'm going to hold off from looking at recommendations since there is a bit of overlap, and we'll look now at operational support. And moving to the next slide. So this principle considers the support and resources available to MARAC and whether they're sufficient to respond to MARAC's needs. Again, we've been touching on this, and Katie and Catherine already made some comments on the lack of resources. But in this principle, we consider things such as having a dedicated coordinator, administrative support, and clear routes for addressing issues. There were several barriers and challenges identified here, namely throughout the interviews, and particularly barriers which participants thought affected an effective partnership with agencies, such as lack of resources, lack of capacity, or limited funding, and also some issues around communication between agencies, even though most participants reflected on this communication and were overall happy with the level of communication. I would like to focus on the issue of under-resourcing, which Catherine mentioned very briefly as well. But this has clearly implications for professionals' abilities to dedicate time and attention towards MARAC and MARAC-related tasks. And this was seen not only for MARAC workers, such as coordinators and chairs, but also for partner agencies. And as it was mentioned before, the fact that MARAC work is usually a side or an add-on job, it means that representatives need to manage the demands of their full-time job. And sometimes MARACs, obviously due to the lack of time and resources, MARACs are not prioritized. This was also seen amongst MARAC workers, as I said, for instance, coordinators, several of them said they did not have enough administrative support. One of the interviewees claimed that this was a 3-person job. So the job is almost amalgamated into one. And with the increasing caseloads, particularly during the pandemic, this was even further complicated. We have a quote here, which I think reflects this frustration. It says, "I think I should be spending more time building relationships with agencies and sort of tackling the issues that affect MARAC. I just actually don't have the time to do it, really. I just don't know how to fix it." So obviously the issue of under-resourcing affects and is cross-cutting across all MARACs. There were also difficulties around sharing that were identified by participants in the interviews as well. And this was mostly linked to lack of consistency as a result of quick staff turnover, and as well as pointed out by several chairs, the lack of training Many of them felt like they were thrown into the job without proper or formal training. And obviously this has implications for the ability to maintain a collaborative approach and to maintain those relationships. Can I have the next slide? So in Principle 9, it's also important to look at research and support in the delivery of MARAC meetings. And perhaps unsurprisingly, since we highlighted all these issues in terms of lack of resources and time, the majority of interviewees said that they did not necessarily rely on any research. Often they didn't have much time to engage with research, although they did look at both Standing Together and Safe Lives website often to seek any clarification. Mostly, however, they sought for support amongst colleagues within MARACs across London and also their own teams. Some participants actually advocated for increased contact and sharing of expertise across boroughs. And steering groups, coordinators forums, and even informal meetings were thought as ideal platforms to share expertise and to share knowledge. Some proposed even having regular chairs, forums, or meetings. Of course, this was once again impacted by COVID-19, since informal meetings, for instance, were no longer happening and everything moved to an online platform. But I'll talk about that later. In terms of recommendations, our main recommendation is that MOPAC creates an intersectional framework for funding and resourcing for MARACs. MOPAC should meet with regional partners to explore how funding can be sustainable and lobby for national change. And also other recommendations that have been mentioned in terms of training for participants or representatives and MARAC workers, as well as ensuring representation from local diverse communities. We move now to Principle 10. Thank you. So this principle looks at governance, and if we could have the next slide, thank you. So this expects that MARACs have a clear governance structure in place, which provides leadership and accountability for the MARAC. And this is demonstrated by a clear operating and information sharing protocol, as well as having a steering group. And very positive finding, the majority of survey participants agreed that their MARAC conforms to the principle of governance. And during the interviews, most participants, majority, rated the performance of their MARACs very highly, around 7 or 8 out of 10. However, from the desktop review, it was clear that not all MARACs appear to have a MARAC operating protocol, which is of concern. Most survey participants reported that their local MARAC indeed have a steering group, but it was also clear in the open-ended responses that there is a need for more visibility around these groups. And although Catherine already touched on this, I would just like to highlight again the issue of uniformity and consistency around MARACs, which was in the interviews, it came up associated to many gaps. The fact that there are different referral forms, different frequency with MARACs, and how this affects the possibility for cross-borough collaboration. And here participants suggested increasing uniformity around these issues, implementing uniform strategies to allow for that cross-borough collaboration. Of course, there's a need to strike a balance here between having this uniformity, but at the same time, ensuring that there is flexibility to allow MARACs to evolve and also to adapt to the needs of their local communities. Thank you. So in terms of recommendations, we believe it's crucial that all London MARACs have a clear operating protocol in terms of reference, so there is a clear process and structure, which is monitored by a local MARAC steering group. We also suggest that MOPAC may wish to consider a London-wide MARAC steering group. Our other recommendation is that London MARACs follow the Safe Lives 10 principles for an effective MARAC and any development Safe Lives make. They should be reviewing performance against this regularly at their local steering groups. So that's all of it in terms of the 10 principles, but we had other findings emerging that we'd like to turn to now. And obviously, given the timing of this research, the impact of COVID can't be overlooked. And throughout the interviews particularly, there were several changes that were reported to the way MARAC is delivered and run, which were brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated restrictions. And the main change, of course, was the move to an online platform. And participants believe this had both advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, the fact that online meetings are more accessible and less time consuming, and that representatives don't have to travel across London to speak for 10 minutes, as some said during the interviews, and this resulted in better attendance. However, it wasn't clear for some participants whether better attendance actually meant more engagement. And some also pointed out logistical issues with Zoom and Microsoft Teams, difficulties in managing participation through an online platform and establishing rapport with partner agencies, particularly since there is no personal contact, let's say, or face-to-face contact. And again, increased MARAC referrals from partner agencies, as well as obviously consequently high caseloads, which seem to reflect an increase in domestic abuse cases throughout the pandemic, and particularly during periods of national lockdown. And in response to this, some MARACs increased the frequency of their meetings. So I'll leave it at that and pass on to Katie, I think. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Joanna. So one of the other objectives of the review was just to ascertain via the surveys around trust and confidence in policing in respect of MARAC cases. And as I said, this was covered in the survey, so I've broken it down by the different surveys. The quantitative findings show that a majority of participants agreed that agencies have trust in policing where MARAC cases are involved. And the open-ended responses shed further light on why some participants believe there could be a lack of confidence among some agencies. So in relation to the partner agency survey, 73% of those participants felt there was trust and confidence. And some of those responses described effective communication and good working relationships between the police and agencies. Other participants expressed a more equivocal view on the levels of trust of collaboration, sometimes describing issues around communication, misaligned expectations, or a lack of confidence in the police ability to deliver just outcomes for survivors. And as with the participants' responses regarding their own capacity to participate in the process, several cited high caseloads and the lack of corresponding resources as a major barrier for police impacting on that trust and confidence. And another source was diminished trust. Diminished trust was the perception that police at times had failed to focus on the survivors' needs, or indeed there had been victim blaming behaviour. In relation to the specialist organisations, 66% of those participants felt that there was trust and confidence. Some described really positive working relationships with police and other agencies, with police fulfilling an integral role within their MARAC. Some reported more mixed attitudes towards the police or described inconsistent or variable practices by frontline officers, so not necessarily the officers that they engage with via the MARAC process. And others described significant issues around the local police response to domestic abuse, which had then impacted on their trust. I'll just pass to you, Catherine, for the final finding, and then I'll be back with you shortly.
Thank you, Katie. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when we gathered data from interviewees, they advanced a number of key suggestions that they believed could improve MARAC provision, which ranged from increasing communication to ensuring uniformity across boroughs. And a number of those we've already discussed and are already in place to address challenges within MARAC. But some of the key ones that they spoke about were good action planning, which obviously is crucial for ensuring survivor safety, good research, which is something that had been picked up as an area that was possibly lacking for some agencies, linked to the resourcing and capacity issues that Katie and Joanna have also spoken about. Efficient information sharing and enough time to discuss cases. So as we've seen with the rise in caseload, meetings can maybe feel very rushed. It can be challenging for agencies to share enough information during that time and to devote the time and care that each case needs. Representation that reflects borough needs, so a more representative panel of people in MARAC meetings and contributing to MARAC meetings. A more structured and streamlined process, so making the referral pathways maybe clearer or easier for people to follow who are less involved with MARAC on a regular basis. Consistent attendance, but also engagement and taking more ownership of the process. Good chairing, obviously another one, which is hugely important for the meeting. Good relationships, so agencies having a regular point of contact, knowing who the right person is at your kind of partner agencies. And finally, much more of a focus on perpetrator management. So that was one of the areas that people feel very strongly about, and that maybe they felt was lacking currently, is, as Joanna's really brilliantly explained, is that while the process should be survivor-led and survivor-centred, we shouldn't be responsibilising survivors or putting the burden of the process onto them. So a major focus needs to be holding perpetrators accountable. I think that's quite a good point to end on. But yeah, those were the main points that they thought could lead to an ideal MARAC. Thank you. I'll hand back to you now, Katie.
Great, I'll just wrap that up because I've just seen the time. So just in terms of the summary, there was quite a few recommendations there. Apologies for it being quite squashed onto the screen. There's quite a lot of information to take in there. But as the report is going to be published this afternoon, we are hoping that you've enjoyed this and that it's been interesting. I just want to extend our thanks to everybody who took part in this. We really appreciate your time and effort, and it's been very insightful. And I will pass back to Goody for our Q&A session.
Thanks, Katie. That was great. I have to say, we've got a lot of questions, which just shows the level of interest in this event, but also what's happening with MARAC. So I'm going to go straight to them. So if we could just, everyone put your cameras on so we can have the panel. I'm going to get cracking on the questions, and I'm going to basically reduce my wrap up to like 1 minute just to say goodbye to everyone, because I think it's really important that we get on with these questions. So let's start. The first question was, and I think who we got? We've got Katie, Joanna, Catherine, I can't see everyone. Olamide, you're there, brilliant. We've got Susan, and we've got Leslie as well from MOPAC. Leslie, you haven't introduced yourselves yet, so do you want to say hi to everyone? And Olamide.
Thanks, Goody. Yes, I'm Leslie Webber, and I'm a VOG Programme Manager at MOPAC.
Okay, it's lovely. And Olamide?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Olamide, and Senior Research Fellow and Head of Center for Abuse Research. Yeah, we're basically we obviously did this work with Standing Together, and it's just been brilliant. And we're just obviously MOPAC commissioning this very vital work as well. So lovely to be here with you all.
Okay, and just to reassure everyone that's in, we're going until 2:30, but people will have to leave. If there are other questions, you can come back to us. So the first one is from Nisha. Multiple boroughs received a request from MPS for a copy of MARAC minutes to dip sample. Knowing the amount of sensitive data on the minutes, would this be covered by our MARAC data sharing, info sharing agreements? Is there a guideline around this? Does anyone want to answer that question? I'm looking straight at Katie.
I'm happy to answer that one. I think it should be covered by your information sharing protocol around when these requests come in. So I would check with the coordination team, or if you are indeed part of the MARAC coordination team, just to check within your protocol, because it should then say whether you need to link in with the agencies who shared information, depending on what that request covers. But I'm happy to discuss further if that would help, Nisha. You're on mute, Goody.
I just realised I'm going to keep myself off mute now. So the next question is from Naz. Are there any guidance on adult family violence referral pathways to MARAC that any of you are aware of? Leslie?
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, just in response to Naz's question, but also perhaps taking Bal's question as well, around increased violence, if that's okay. Yeah, so. Yeah. I think, just sort of in broader terms, just thinking about the diversity of people in London, there is a need for a framework to be created with an intersectional lens, but that should be business as usual, ideally. But it is right that other forms of VOG are identified within the context of each case and addressed as a whole. So I guess an effective MARAC should ideally have protocols in place that ensure that there are clear links and referral mechanisms with other public protection arrangements. So like child, adult safeguarding, youth offending, any other risk-related forum or panel. And I also think it's important that we look at any other risks that could be falling through the gap in multi-agency safety planning, for example, any other types of VOG risks, such as harmful practices or adult family violence, that they are identified and that we're able to, that local areas are able to identify the right forum for them to be heard in so that they don't fall through the gaps. I think just kind of looking at it with an intersectional lens, there has been a division in engagement from local services that can sometimes be based on commission provision. So depending on what services are available, what expertise there is available to be able to support with identifying risk and how to manage it. But it's essential that wherever practically possible, that all services available in each area equal partners in the delivery of the MARAC process at all of its levels. And just going back to what you've already discussed today, and it's been mentioned a few times, it's important that bioinfo services and practitioners are involved in the governance of the MARAC. So again, that just thinking for both questions in terms of adult family violence and with the intersectional lens on, that we have attendance at the MARAC or a contribution to the MARAC steering group from specialist services and from the right professionals who are all sitting around the table. So that provides some context.
Thanks, Leslie. Did anyone want to add to that? Anita, you look like you, yeah.
Yeah, I will, just because I was just thinking about some of the work we obviously have been doing separately in a different context with Joanna. Obviously, we did a review for you, didn't we, Goody, to look at harmful practice cases that were referred to MARACS between 2018 to 2021. And actually, that was very interesting because some of what we were actually identifying is the idea that, well, I suspect, is it the Asian Women's Resource Center, I think, their involvement in obviously harmful practice and actually improving training and kind of working with organizations in London seem to have really improved the number of cases and referrals going into MARAC. So we think there's something there. Obviously, there's more research to be done, but one of the things that was very clear, and feel free, Joanna, to jump in, is that there is a need to actually ensure that the complexity of those cases are being reflected within MARACS. There is a gap that has been identified in the sense that there is still much work to be done in terms of ensuring that we have an understanding of harmful practice cases and actually how we can better ensure that survivors are represented within those spaces as well. So I think it's sort of a piece of work that, I don't know if Sally and Fran Richards are on the call, but we're really keen to kind of do some more work in there, because again, like adult family violence, I think the area of harmful practices within MARACS is actually a massive gap as well in terms of research, and it's something we've identified that we should do something about as well. Thanks. Joanna, do you want to add something to that? I don't know, because I know you worked with me on that review.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to highlight as well that I think it's important to bring in survivors' voices into the conversation around harmful practices, and it's something that research is lacking as well. And obviously it might be difficult because we know all these issues around reporting and identifying these cases, but I think that's important as well from a point of view of intersectionality of research even, and to ensure that we have everyone's voices into the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to move on to some of the other questions, because if people have extra things to say on that, they can bring it in. Hi, Tal, it's lovely. I can't see you, but it's lovely to have you here. Ask the question, did the research look into the effectiveness and appropriateness of MARAC chairs and whether outcomes actually reflected survivors' wishes, which I think is a really important and good question. Anyone want to come in on that?
I can speak to that. So we weren't able to go as in depth as we'd have liked. We had a smaller sample in terms of that, but we did pick up on some of those issues around consistency, around chairing, and I think that's sort of led into our recommendation around sort of further work around performance assessment to kind of focus and have a look at that wider picture rather than it, the MARAC meeting. Often what happens is the meeting happens, coordinators wouldn't necessarily know the outcomes. It's mostly going to be other agencies that hold that. So there is a need for all of those agencies to come together to sort of have a look at what that framework might look like, so we can effectively measure performance and see how that sort of plays out sort of moving forward. But I think it's kind of highlighted the need for further work to be done to look at that in far more depth moving forward.
I'd agree. Everyone's nodding, so I take it. Has anyone got anything to add to that?
Just to add as well that one of the, I think, amazing things about this piece of work is that it almost serves as a sort of baseline for us to see, to kind of measure distance traveled as we go ahead. So I guess in a way, it sets a bit of an agenda for MOPAC as well to see where they want to, how they want to begin to address some of these issues and some of the findings and recommendations that we've made in the report. But I think it actually is almost for London, it gives that sense of this is where we are and this is where we need to be kind of could go. And so we can look back and say, okay, so we want to look at effectiveness in the future. How do we begin to measure that? And I think that's where that steering group that we have recommended would really, that multi-agency steering group will be very important going forward to ensure that, every single agency is actually feeding into that framework that you'll be developing, I think.
I agree. It's interesting. I'm just going to link in another question that kind of links to that. Someone's saying, I still feel unclear on the place of daily MARACs within the London boroughs and how they could be compared to ones held monthly or more regularly. And I think that speaks to a similar thing, right? These findings were about looking at that, but we haven't got the answers yet because we had to figure out what was going on first, right? I just wondered if anyone, because that's a really interesting question because people ask it a lot. So I wondered if people wanted to say anything more about that. Love it. Everyone's being so polite. Anyone?
I think I'll take a stab at it because, again, in the previous work that I'd done, which included areas outside of London, which of the services, we're based in Suffolk, and it obviously included quite a bit of the East of England area. I think this question around what is the ideal MARAC in relation to frequency I think it's not a very simple answer in terms of, daily MARACs are the best, or monthly MARACs are the best, or bi-monthly, or whatever. I think it should go down to, and actually that's one of the things that hopefully is jumping out from the report when you do read it, is that it actually goes down to what is needed within that particular area and that community. So, we can't, even though we're also calling for a structured and streamlined process, I think we shouldn't lose that. We spoke to people that are doing daily MARACs, they have their own different way of doing stuff. And then they also had people that are doing it on a monthly basis. I think I suppose for me, one of the things we need to be careful of is that we're not saying we're comparing apple and oranges together. I think we need to be ensuring that what are we really measuring? If it's about performance, we should not really be bogged down by, people having MARACs daily. Maybe that's what's working for them. I think we need to really be able to compare and contrast in a way that actually is embedded within the context of that particular borough and that particular community. So just to give you an example, I think that from what we know from that the other piece of work I was talking about, harmful practices, we know that it can be very complex. So, you can't, you need more time, for instance, to have when cases come through MARACs, right? So if they're coming in on a sort of daily basis, for instance, you need to respond really quickly. Rather, you can't say that, you want to tell someone to wait, for until the end of the month for you to actually address those issues. So I think it's about looking at what is really needed within those boroughs. So it would take sort of expanding this work to drill down into really what the not just what the caseload looks like, but what the characteristics of that particular community looks like as well.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And also that it's not just a meeting, it is a process, like Katie said at the very beginning. And also, I guess the only thing is making sure that the survivor voice, that's what really came out in this report, right, is central to anything that anyone is doing and that it's included appropriately and properly. So some of the other questions that came up as well, we've got something here about, let me have a look, around the DASH risk assessment. And did we have any findings about the suitability, effectiveness of this?
Yeah, I'll go if that's all right for this one. Yeah, so we did find obviously DASH is incredibly commonly used both within MARACs but also within the police and other agencies, and obviously visible high risk, defined as a 14 or more score on the DASH risk assessment, was cited by the highest proportion of survey participants as something they used, but we do know from recent research that actually the DASH doesn't have that good predictive accuracy necessarily. At least some research seems to point to that. So it's quite weakly predictive of future harms and re-victimization. However, we did argue that may be counterbalanced by the fact there are all these other kind of equally commonly used measures, such as the professional judgment and the re-victimization as well. So yeah, that was one possible concern that we raised around the DASH.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm really conscious we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to bring one more in if I can, and then we've got people also sharing other best practice, which is really good to see, because I think if we had longer we'd have so much to say. Oh god, there's more and more questions coming in. I don't know which one to pick. I guess one from Chloe. I'm interested to know what was in the data that indicated the need for this increased cultural competency.
I think I can speak about that a little bit, because it came across the interviews a lot when we were discussing diversity of survivors' voices. And one of the things participants indicated, as I had said during the presentation, was that perhaps there is a lack of understanding of the cultural context of certain survivors or certain victims, and how that affects their experiences and their reluctance to engage with MARACs, for instance, or whatever support they receive. And they actually put forward the suggestions in terms of increasing cultural competence and providing training, not only for MARAC workers, but for all the representatives across outside buy-in for agencies. So this was a suggestion that they put forward.
Thank you so much. Right, we have 1 minute. I think if I don't close this, we could go on. We're going to release the report shortly on our websites. Oh, Leslie, you've got your finger up.
Can I just jump in before you close? Is that okay?
Sure.
I just wanted to give some reflections from MOPAC before you close for the day. So I guess first and foremost, thank you for the report. We really do welcome it and the recommendations, and it also gives us a lot of food for thought to take away, but we do need time to go and digest the recommendations and also to look at how we're going to move forward. So we'll work closely with Sophie, with the Deputy Mayor and our partners to understand further what they mean and establish what is possible. But also our biggest consideration is that, of course, around resources and looking at that from across the board with service providers, statutory agencies, regional bodies, and also ensure that responsibility for these processes are shared across London appropriately. So we will discuss with our partners, we'll work with our partners how we can take the recommendations forward, how they can work in practice. And we'll also work with central government as well, look at lobbying and anticipating that there could be some direction in the forthcoming domestic abuse strategy, which will and should include some focus on MARACs and how these are supported. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Of course, I should have put you in. That's really great to hear. Thanks, everyone. I mean, from the questions alone, we've also got Nicole saying about, in terms of her role and being at this event and looking at and commending MOPAC for commissioning this research. I think we all realise this is a starting point. You couldn't put it better. Olamide, starting point, so much work to do. And we really look forward to taking the conversation forward and engaging with you more on this as well. So thank you so much, MOPAC, for commissioning this. And it's been a pleasure working with all of you on this work.
Same here. Yeah. Oh, actually, one more thing. Can I just say thank you also to all the MARAC coordinators and chairs that actually participated, because obviously without them, we wouldn't even have been able to do the report. I know we have thanked them in the reports as well, but I just wanted to make that, because I know some of them are probably on the call. But yeah, we obviously, I mean, one of the things that came across was how challenging an environment it is for them to do the work they're doing, and they're still doing it with, with obviously all the energy and within the limits of their jobs. But that's something I think we just, as academics and researchers, we just wanted to mention and just say thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, that has been a great wrap up by all of us rather than just one. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and hope you have a lovely afternoon and take care of yourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Goody. Bye.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.